Hello there. I am doing a video review of Love Your God with All Your Mind by Dr. J.P. Moreland. And this is for EDU 933. This is assignment 4.2 for the class I'm taking at Fresno, and I am thankful to have the opportunity to share this with you. I found this to be a pretty interesting and insightful read. One of the things I said, even in something I typed up earlier today, was that it certainly seems timely. Dr. Moreland spends a considerable amount of time even you could say chastising the modern evangelical church for an embracing of anti-intellectualism. And I think what's important to recognize in terms of that is with the embracing of an anti-intellectualism comes a misunderstanding of not only what it means to be Christians in the world that we live in today, but maybe more importantly, how we are to be Christians in the world that we live in today. And in fact, I said that I thought the book was timely, I think last updated in 2012, because I think it spoke to a lot of the things that evangelicals have struggled with mightily the last 4 years in particular. And even in things that we've seen in the last 4 weeks and in the last week now. I think, and I'm not, I don't have any intention of getting political here, but what does it look like when Christians over the course of several generations have lost the ability to think in terms of the decisions that we make and who we follow and why? I think that he was addressing that in this book, maybe without even recognizing that it was something that was going to have to be addressed. And I said I don't want to get political, and I'm not, but I will say I think that's on both sides of what we would call the political aisle. That has been a fascinating phenomenon to me over the last 4 years in particular, because we've become so sensitized to it, but really for the last generation, we have professing evangelical Christians that really find themselves believing that the best manifestation of the Christian faith is on what we would call politically the left side of the aisle. And we have professing evangelical Christians who believe that the best manifestation, or I could say the most biblical manifestation of what it means to be a Christian, is on what is on the right or political side of the aisle. And I'm not here to necessarily say anything about one or the other, but I will say this in terms of some of the stuff that Dr. Moreland talks about. It's a fallacy to think that you both can be right. And so I found that very interesting and timely. I just want to quickly now go through each of the chapters, and in doing so, give a brief outline of what the book covers, and then relay a question that I have that I don't think there's an answer to. I don't have an answer to it, but I think it's a question worth asking after going through and reading the book. So chapter 1 kind of deals with the perception of the world that Christians are not intelligent. And Dr. Moreland asked the question, what does it mean to be salty when we are called to be the salt of the earth? And not only what does it mean to be salty, but I think more importantly, how do we do that? How do we be salty? And he talks about, in terms of the anti-intellectualism that has seeped into the evangelical church, he talks about a worldview shift, and even a worldview shift that has taken place in the broader culture, and that's a worldview shift towards secularism. But then he connects that to anti-intellectualism within the church. Biblically, he talks about faith being the power or skill to act in accordance with the nature of the kingdom of God, a trust in what we have reason to believe is true. And I quote that because one of the questions I have is this pitting against faith and reason, and he would say that that's a straw man. We aren't really pitting faith against reason. And then he talks about the importance of discipleship. So how do we get from being anti-intellectual Christians to really developing our minds in a Christ-like way? And he talks about discipleship as an end to that. In chapter 2, we ask the question, what does it mean to look like God and to honor his name? And here is where he really stresses the idea of discipleship. And we look like God and we honor his name by being intellectual and developing the mind. And so discipleship plays into that. How does the church, or how should the church, especially in evangelical circles, continue to work to develop the mind of believers? If that's not happening, Dr. Moreland would say it should be, and it's missing. If it is, are we doing it to the best of our ability? In chapter 3, he asks the question, how does the mind work? And he discusses the role of the mind in accomplishing change. And to use different terminology, we could say the mind's role in transformation. And I found this to be very interesting because there's a piece of the puzzle that I think maybe is often missing in Christianity when we don't think about the mind's role in accomplishing transformation. And this gets into things such as habits and formation. I would think, since this was written, the works of someone like Dr. James K.A. Smith, You Are What You Love, and that type of stuff plays into this as well. Like we do what we love, but we can form what we do. And then what is the intellectual component of that? So I think those 3 chapters laying out kind of the beginning aspect of the book. In chapter 4, he talks about the enemies that we have, those things that are against us in terms of developing our mind. And he specifically references the empty self. He references the fear of losing control, the idea of insecurity. I think this is really important. As a pastor and a teacher, it's really interesting to me to think about those things that my students or my parishioners have to deal with. Like, I just want to think about getting them to think rightly. What are the stumbling blocks? What are the things that are in the way between here and there of getting them to think rightly? And that's looking at things like insecurity and fear of losing control. It's looking at things like people needing to be okay with being somewhat vulnerable to recognize, oh, I'm not thinking rightly on this, and I don't know how to think on this, and I need to move past that. In chapter 5, he talks specifically about what are the things we can do to develop the Christian mind. He does a study in terms of understanding logic. He discusses fallacies so that we can understand how these things work. And I found that fascinating. Years ago now, I had to take the college I was at. Everybody had to take logic as one of the required core courses. And certainly a formal study of logic opened up my mind to understanding where people are wrong in their arguments and in their thinking, and talking about informal fallacies and things like that. And this is something that is lost on a lot of people today. Now, the other side of this coin is, I wonder where has all the common sense gone as well. And that would not necessarily entail a formal study of logic, but it was interesting nonetheless. In chapter 6, he talks specifically about connecting the developed mind to evangelism. So here's the idea. One of the things that I think we could say that he is saying is that evangelism, Christian evangelism, has gotten to be pretty poor, but it's gotten to be pretty poor because we've embraced anti-intellectualism. Meaning, if I train and develop my mind according to the will of God, I will be better at evangelism. If I train and develop my mind according to the will of God, I'll be better at apologetics. Apologetics, being able to defend the faith. And I think we should recognize that there is no evangelism on one hand without apologetics, without being able to defend the faith. And so I thought that was really important. And it caused me to think a bit about who are the students that I have in front of me each and every day. There are times when I receive questions from students who are outside of the faith that are very astute questions. And am I in a position and am I prepared to be able to answer those questions and answer them rightly? Chapters 7 and 8 go together. They're two parts of discussing the reasons of God's existence, the reasons, as he says, to know God exists. And he covers even more so what we could call apologetics proper. But in terms of this, he talks about these evidences and understanding how to think through these things, not only in terms of God exists, but it also helps us to know what he is like. If we look at these evidences and we think about them rightly, we begin to see that God is one and is personal. He spends the whole of chapter 9 then moving away from the reasons to believe God's existence and to camp out specifically on the various evidences for Jesus. The very various evidences that Jesus did exist, the evidence of the things that he accomplished. And what I think is most important there is then answering the question, so what? It doesn't get us far enough to be able to develop our mind, to be able to say and to prove and to reason that Jesus existed. We need to go all the way to say, why is it important? We look throughout history and we see that millions and millions and millions of people have been affected because of this person in history who did exist. So there's the beginning of answering the question, so what? In chapter 10, Dr. Moreland talks about the local church and Christianity. He talks about the need for the local church to first embrace this and then to start training people, whether it's in sermons or Sunday schools or Bible studies or at conferences, to actually believe that this is important enough to invest our resources within the ministry so that Christians can then be part of the intellectual discussion of writing and teaching and defending the faith. And so chapter 10 was a real charge to the church. And I think by extrapolation, then we can certainly apply that to things like Christian education, where the church says, yeah, we do need to do this. Well, how do we do this? Where do we start? Right? Well, let's start with the children in our church. And let's give them an opportunity to learn and be trained from even those earliest ages. Now, that's a very quick and rough overview of the book, but I did want to very quickly, I know I'm already over time here, I want to very quickly address one question that I think is important. I don't have an answer, but I think it's a question worth asking Dr. Moreland or asking in terms of the conversation. I'm going to quote him from chapter 10. He says this: first, why is our impact not proportionate to our numbers? If the evangelical community is even 1/3 the size polls tell us it is, we should be turning this culture upside down. Second, why are ministers no longer viewed as the intellectual and cultural leaders in their communities that they once were? Now, I don't want to be, nor do I believe I stand in the position to be critical of Dr. Moreland and his work. I agree with most, if not all, of everything that he wrote in this book. And I do think he's got his finger on an issue that needs to be dealt with within the church. With all of that being equal, I wonder about the veracity of his standard. Meaning, this is his measuring rod. He's looking at the church today and he's saying, basically, we should be having more of an impact. And we're not having as much of an impact as I think we should have. So that means we've failed somewhere along the line. Now, I need to be careful here because he certainly doesn't equate impact with success. He doesn't say, why are we not more successful as the evangelical church? But I think what he says could easily be interpreted that way and could be read that way. And I'm hesitant for that to be the standard. On some level, hasn't the church always tried to do what he is talking about? I think this is a question worth asking. And again, as I said, I don't have the answer. I'm not asking this to specifically be critical. But I am someone who teaches in Christian schools, and I've taught in Christian schools since 2001. I am someone who's been in ministry in the church almost as long. And it's a question worth asking. Hasn't the church always tried to do what he is talking about? To various degrees of success. But let's remember, Bonhoeffer wrote the vast majority of his works from prison. Was Bonhoeffer impacting the culture right then and there? It's a question, I think, worth teasing out the answer to a little bit. I think because he wrote, he's been impacting the culture for the good intellectually, by the way, ever since. He continues to impact the culture. Did he have an impact on the culture then and there? I think he probably did. Did it look like a cursory view was completely unsuccessful? Well, I mean, he's writing from prison. He dies. And this goes all the way back, right? Paul wrote so much from prison. He ended up in prison. Did Paul continue to impact the culture? I think so. I don't know. Here's where I'm going with this. I don't know if a perceived lack of impacting the culture is indicative of the fact that Christianity is anti-intellectual or has been dumbed down. I don't know. I think that there are aspects of evangelical Christianity that are that today. But I don't think it's ever completely gone away in the church. I think these things wax and wane. So are we to expect it to translate to acceptance? That is, doing the stuff that Dr. Moreland says we should be doing, that he says we aren't doing. Are we to expect it to translate to acceptance at the cultural, sociological, and intellectual table? Does success equal success? I think it's a question worth teasing out. Now, I think part of the answer is that Dr. Moreland's not talking about that. He's talking about Christians being able to give an intellectual answer, a reasonable defense, regardless of whether or not it's accepted, regardless of whether or not it changes people's minds. But he does specifically ask and look for an impact on the culture, and I think he's defining that to some degree as the culture changes, which is success, and I'm hesitant. So I hope that that's a question that can be dealt with at some time in the future. I enjoyed the book. I really liked reading it, and I learned a lot. things that I will apply not only to my teaching, but also in my pastoral ministry. And I know I've gone way over, but I hope you enjoy this as well. Thanks so much.